Hello, hello. Welcome to another episode of the ETS Travel Podcast. If this is your first time listening to the ETS Travel Podcast, I'm John Cavarra, a business development manager here with ETS. And with me is also my fellow business development manager, Bethany. And today we're going to be focusing on something that quietly connects many ETS journeys together. 6 monasteries that sit at the crossroads of history, faith, and pilgrimage. So today we're going to be covering a lot of these different monasteries. So Bethany, when you look at these sites together in these monasteries, what stands out to you?
Yeah, definitely. Monasteries preserve living continuity back to the early Christians and early Christianity. And that's something, if you've listened to a few of the podcast episodes at this point, you've heard me talk a lot about and how I feel it's important. You know, they're not just museums, they're not just libraries, they're active communities that have been praying and focusing on worship, you know, all the way back almost to the time of Christ. Like some of the earliest and oldest monasteries came, you know, less than 100 years after him. So, you know, they're connecting geography to spiritual formation. And, you know, they often sit at hinge points of biblical history or church traditions and different history that came out of that was shaped by those monastic communities. So I'm definitely excited to share with you guys today a little bit about those different connections and why it's so neat to visit some of these places.
Awesome. So, in a way, monasteries call out to us and remind us why we're traveling, right?
Definitely. You know, they interrupt the pace of sightseeing. They shift the focus. You know, instead of information gathering, it helps kind of shift the travelers to more spiritual reflection or thinking about that. And so that's often where transformation can happen, and they can end up feeling a deeper connection, again, to their history.
Awesome. So let's start in Greece, on the island of Patmos, holy monastery of St. John the Theologian. So what makes this monastery so central to ETS itineraries?
Oh, it's definitely a fan favorite for sure. People love going to Patmos. It's a beautiful island now, despite the fact that it was a former Roman penal colony and there was basically nothing there but caves and political prisoners at the time of John when he's writing the book of Revelation. But now it's an awesome place. There's been a community there now for over 900 years. Wow. So when you're talking about some of the oldest monasteries, that definitely gets up there. So you have to think about, if I'm visiting Patmos today, I'm joining in this line of 900 years of pilgrims that have visited there. You know, and it anchors the entire 7 churches of the Revelation journey. While it is difficult to get to the island of Patmos, it really does help connect, you know, where the book of Revelations came from and the visions of John. And then after that, going and seeing the churches of the Revelation in Turkey, it just makes a little bit more of an impact for sure. And they've managed to preserve centuries of Orthodox liturgy and manuscript traditions, all of that there. You know, when you're visiting the monastery itself, it's overlooking the Grotto of the Apocalypse, and you go down into that, and it's now like a separate chapel. So it gives you physical context to the apocalyptic scriptures. They have if you actually stay on Patmos and spend time there, they have over 330 manuscripts, including 82 of the New Testament. I mean, really, really going far back, some in ancient Greek and things like that. So it's incredible that they've preserved that and that people can go and still study and connect to the word as we have it today in the Bible. And they even house refugees from the fall of Constantinople. So Constantinople, of course, was Christian city, and then it fell to the Ottoman Empire and people fled. And one of the first places that took them in was the monastery there in Patmos.
Awesome. So in Patmos, Revelation isn't just something you read, it's something you experience across different kinds of places, right?
Yeah, it definitely is. It's less about a single path and more about the layers of meaning that can be tied to geography. The cave represents revelation received in isolation and exile, whereas the monastery represents how that revelation has been preserved and studied and handed down through centuries of worship. And the surrounding island environment gives you the broader world John was physically separated from. So, what is beautiful today, you just got to kind of take away all the buildings and focus more on the cave and just think about how, again, he was isolated, as desolate. And then you go to some place like Ephesus and you're like, oh, this was this big, beautiful city. And thank goodness the Christians there sent him some food. So he survived his time on Patmos.
Right.
So, it's more like standing in one place and realizing you're looking at scripture from multiple dimensions all at once, historical, spiritual, geographical, all at the same time.
Awesome. So, next, we'll jump right into Meteora. So, otherwise, one of the monasteries in the sky is what you would call it. So, it's a place that is one of the most visually striking places that ETS travelers ever visit. Would you say?
Oh, definitely. It's one of those places where just the natural rock formations, you kind of sit there and you're like, wow, this is God's amazing creation. And it's always amazing when you encounter something really unique, especially to maybe, you live in the Midwest and it's kind of flat and you see these giant kind of weird mountainous formations. And then you think about the early Christians, like, Paul would have walked through this area on his way to Athens, coming from his time in Thessaloniki and Philippi and all of that. And the fact that then people went back and built monasteries on top of these crazy rock pillars, and just how much work that would have taken. That they started out as hermit shelters. They later developed into full monastic complexes that still operate today. There's still monks that live there. And, it just represents Byzantine survival spirituality. So from the time of the Byzantines to now, it's run through the Orthodox Church, all those monasteries up there, again, centuries of people worshiping and preserving the history and the early Christianity, and so it's rightfully recognized, now as UNESCO World Heritage Site.
Awesome. And from that vantage point, it almost looks like the world has been removed from beneath them, the people that visit there. So what would you say being up at Meteora means for those travelers that are there at that time?
Yeah, definitely that feeling that like you've withdrawn from the world of chaos and you can appreciate the focus on your spiritual life and prayer, and how sometimes just separating yourself, even if it's just going away into a quiet room, can help you feel more connected. And the visual theology of separation and devotion, again, I'll use that example. Sometimes there's just so much going on. There's pets that are distracting you. You've got your family. You're thinking about the dishes in the sink. There's a TV on in the living room that's down the hall. So sometimes to really pray and really connect, separating yourself off and being a monk for a minute, and finding that quiet to really help you connect, it's still important. So it's cool that they still do that in Meteora today.
Awesome. So, before we move on, you just used a word that will come up multiple times as we talk about monasteries, and some might not be very familiar with it. Well, at least I don't fully understand it. What does ascetic mean?
Yeah, so in Christian history, it refers to a way of life that intentionally practices self-discipline for spiritual focus. So that's definitely something that continues through monasteries from, 900 years ago to now. The idea of the separation and intentional self-deprecation, depriving yourselves of things, and just the pure discipline and learning that to get to that spiritual focus. It's really impressive. So it often implies, simplicity. People think about the fasting, times of silence, limiting distractions or comforts. And the goal isn't punishment. I mean, some people look at monasteries and they're like, oh, I could never live like that. I'd miss the internet. I'd miss this or that. But it really does provide clarity and devotion, removing anything seen as competing with a focused life of prayer and obedience to God. That's why, even within the Protestant churches, there are some people who will fast. And it's not always fasting from food. Sometimes it's fasting from social media, or it's fasting from something that's become a crutch for them. And it's forcing them to take that time they would have devoted to that and focus on something spiritual. So whether you be Orthodox, Catholic, other Protestant denominations, things like that, it's important to get to that self-discipline. And so sometimes you need to take things out or put the focus somewhere else. So in the monastic settings, asceticism is a foundation underneath, but solitary desert monks and structured communities like the Benedictines that we'll talk about, so whether someone's living alone in the wilderness or in a monastery, the ascetic practice is what shapes their daily rhythm and spiritual discipline of letting everything else go. So there's nothing standing between them and their spiritual focus and their connection to God.
Sounds really nice. No, that helps a lot to get an understanding. So it's not really about rejecting life itself. It's more about removing distractions from life so faith becomes the central focus. And that really brings clarity to what we're talking about with these monasteries, whether it's solitude in the desert or structure in a community. The common thread isn't escape, it's intention. All right, so we'll now move into our next monastery and move into Egypt. So moving south into Egypt is the St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai. So this is one of the oldest monasteries in the world. Why does it matter so much to ETS travelers?
Partially because it is one of the oldest monasteries, but traditionally it's linked to Moses and the burning bush and the giving of the Ten Commandments. So it's thought that, the monastery has been built over the site of the burning bush and where Moses heard directly from God the commandments. It's, one of the oldest continuously functioning monasteries, meaning there's not been a time since it was founded where there were not monks and it wasn't being used as a monastery. And I mean, talk about incredible history. They have a huge collection of ancient Christian manuscripts and some of the world's largest collection of Byzantine icons, like that there aren't other copies elsewhere. Because it is located so far out in the wilderness, that geography of the Exodus obviously comes into play, but it's also helped protect it, and it allowed it to continue to still exist to this time. So it helps represent, the continuity of scripture tradition in isolation, their library being the oldest continuously operating library in the world, because of course the one in Alexandria burned down. So it houses the second largest collection of early codices and manuscripts actually globally. It is second only to the Vatican Library. Wow. Just to give you an idea of the scale and just how old and precious some of their documents are. Wow.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So this is where Exodus, geography, and Christian monasticism meet, correct?
Yeah, so it's connecting the Old Testament narrative with your early Christian preservation. So it's both the biblical and historical continuity all in one place. And if you're really adventurous, when we take you to Mount Sinai, we'll wake you up at midnight. If you want to hike up, it's about 4 hours to get up Mount Sinai, but you'll be able to see the sunrise. Let us know in the comments how you feel about that. But the people that are brave enough to do it, which was not me, I like my sleep, said it was absolutely beautiful and shared some awesome pictures. So that is one of the cool things you can do up there as well.
Yeah, I'm sure it's awesome to catch that sunrise up there too. So moving on from Egypt, we're going to go on to Rome, St. Paul outside the walls. So again, this is one of the most visited cities when we're talking about Rome in ETS itineraries. The basilica is different from others that we've discussed. Where would you say it fits into the monastery conversation?
Yeah, so it is not a monastery itself, but the church is built over the traditional burial site of Paul back in the 300s during the time of Constantine. So as we've talked about in other podcasts, Constantine was converted by his mother, Queen Helena, to Christianity, and he sent her off to find holy sites. And so one of those was the burial site of Paul. And because Romans were pretty good record keepers and, rumors and traditions had continued, they had an idea of where he was beheaded, which is a whole separate church, and then another where he was buried. And so it's one of the four major basilicas of Rome because of Paul's importance to the church. But it has been maintained throughout history by a Benedictine monastic community. So, they have always cared for and preserved this important church and holy site. And so they have a strong connection themselves to the Pauline missionary theology, as we'll talk a little more about the Benedictines and some of our other sites as well. And it still serves as a liturgical and pilgrimage center to this day.
Mm-hmm. So would it be fair to say that this site is focused more on the work and mission of the apostles rather than the quiet, withdrawn life of the monks and the monastic communities?
Oh, definitely. It represents witness rather than withdrawal. And the Benedictines especially believed in evangelizing and supporting communities and taking care of them. So they always interacted a lot. They would retreat back to their monasteries at the end of the day and spend time in silence and prayer and that kind of stuff. But they believed it was just as important to connect and build their communities as well. So it's definitely the church remembering Paul's missionary life. Awesome.
Now, we're going to stay in Italy, but we're going to move into the mountains outside of Rome. I'm Italian, so I should know how to pronounce this, but I probably don't.
Subiaco.
Subiaco.
And I learned that because there is a Christian private school that has traveled with us in the past that is named after the mountain Subiaco.
Subiaco.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Very good. Very good. So Subiaco, why is this such a foundational site?
So it's associated with Saint Benedict of Nursia. So he established the community at Subiaco, and he was born near the end of the 4th century. So, not too far into Christianity. And he's definitely regarded as the founder of Western monasticism. So definitely the Catholic and Western versions of it. He is what you think of when you think of monks. Most people think of the Benedictines. They think of the brown robes and the rope belts and the things like that. And the Benedictines still exist to this day and have different communities, including here in the United States. So, Subiaco itself is a site of early monastic retreats where they would stay in caves. And what's funny is in the area of Subiaco, ironically enough, this is the same area where Emperor Nero's villa was located. So you went from party city to now an area that's known for pious monks. And it's the birthplace of the Benedictine rules. So these are the rules of monastic life that even other monasteries and other sects will still follow or, give credence to. And it includes, if you visit Subiaco, you can see the Sacro Specco Monastery, or the Holy Cave. It's been rebuilt because the Allies completely bombed it in World War II and pretty much destroyed it. So it represents structured Western monastic life beginning, as well as continuing to grow and be rebuilt at different times.
So would it be fair to say, going back to Sinai, that Sinai reflects the early desert tradition of monastic life and solitude, while Subiaco represents the beginning of a more structured communal form of monastic living?
Absolutely. That's the distinction. You hit the nail on the head there. So in the early monasteries, it was about seclusion and spiritual focus and preservation, making copies of documents and those kind of things, writing scrolls and starting to write the first Bibles and books and collections of spiritual thought and things like that. Whereas with St. Benedict and Subiaco and the community he grew there, they switched to a much more structured still, but communal form of monastic living. So they would interact with the community, where Sinai monks solely focus on the solitude, the silence, and separation to seek God. Subiaco reflected, shifting to a more missionary heart, where community life and prayer, work, and daily rhythm were important, but you could interact with the community and it was your job to take care of the community. So both are still deeply ascetic, but they express monastic life in different forms rather than opposing ones. One is not more right than the other, and both definitely serve their purposes in history.
Very good. Very good. So the last one that we have to cover, I believe, is the heart of Benedictine monasticism, and that's Monte Cassino. So this one seems to carry an enormous amount of historical weight here.
Yeah, Monte Cassino is a beautiful town if you visit it today and go to the old monastery and everything. But it was founded by St. Benedict himself. So as he left Rome and was evangelizing and setting up more monasteries and more communities of monks, he ended up in Monte Cassino and establishing the monastery there, and he constructed it over a pagan temple to Apollo. So this was always a place of worship going back to the time of the Romans and the Greeks, and it's considered the mother house of Western monasticism. So here is where he built his first really big community that kind of became the example that would be copied. And it's been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times, including World War II during the famous Battle of Monte Cassino. The Allies really had something about bombing monasteries. So, large buildings, maybe they were holding stuff. It was, I can understand why they found them suspicious. But yeah, so a lot of things had to be rebuilt after World War II. But it was a center for Benedictine intellectual and spiritual tradition, including a moral obligation to care for the sick came out of the community at Monte Cassino. So the monks there founded a hospital considered the first in Europe in the new era. So this is, coming out of the Dark Ages, starting hospitals, starting medical practice and all that kind of stuff. It really stems from Monte Cassino and the monks' work and that commitment to not just their spiritual life, but community. So it's a wonderful place to visit. And, you can think about their resilience and continuity that they still have a thriving hospital system in the city today, thanks to the monks.
Gotcha. So in a sense, this is the institutional expression of everything that began at Subiaco. Yeah,
so you visit Subiaco and you're seeing the formation of an idea, and then Monte Cassino is the legacy. It's the fruition, and together they both kind of define Western monastic Christianity and the impacts it can have on community.
Awesome. So we're going to wrap it up now. So we'll just to recap, to connect all of these that we talked about. So when you step back and look at all these monasteries together, Patmos, Meteora, Sinai, Rome, Subiaco, and finally Monte Cassino, what's the unifying thread between them?
Yeah, it's definitely scripture lived out through geography, faith expressed through rhythm and prayer, the continuity of Christian tradition across centuries. I mean, when you think about a community founded, there in Patmos, and over 900 years they've supported pilgrims, that's just amazing. Monastic life is preservation of memory and meaning. We wouldn't know a lot about the writings of the early Christian fathers and wouldn't have that today had it not been preserved for centuries by monasteries. And that pilgrimage is formation, not just tourism. You hope you learn and you grow.
Yep, absolutely. So ETS travelers aren't just visiting monasteries. They're walking through different expressions of how each church is church engages with God across time.
Yep, and each of those sites is going to invite a different kind of response: wonder, silence, reflection, or even renewal.
Awesome. Well, thank you for explaining these monasteries and going over the differences and walking us through each and every one of them. We hope you, the listeners, enjoyed this podcast. We definitely appreciate you listening. Be sure to like, subscribe to the podcast. Let us know how we're doing. And until the next time, hope you have a blessed day.